Men have walked away from relationships with women and from the broader expectations of society, and they are not looking back one bit. Women pushed and pushed for decades until they crossed a line that cannot be uncrossed, and now most of them sit too old to build the families they once took for granted, while finding themselves largely undesirable to the very men they spent years dismissing as toxic or unnecessary. The hard truth that hits like a freight train is this reality. Men have finally realized the game was rigged from the start, and they have chosen peace over chaos, leaving women to face the consequences of their own choices in a world that no longer bends to accommodate endless demands. Stick with this all the way through, because what you are about to hear is not some temporary trend or passing frustration. It is the sobering outcome of 50 years of systematic shifts that have rewritten the rules of interaction between men and women. And once you see the full picture, you will understand why the men who have stepped back are never stepping forward again, and why society itself is feeling the weight of that departure in ways that cannot be ignored or wished away. Listen, friends, we have reached a point where the patterns are so clear and so consistent that ignoring them would be foolish. And the core of it comes down to this decades upon decades of women leveraging every tool available, including movements that framed men as inherent problems to reshape society in ways that consistently extracted value from men while offering little in return. And men finally took notice and decided enough was enough. Think about how it unfolded over time, starting with the steady drumbeat that told men their natural traits were problems to be fixed rather than strengths to be respected. Terms were invented and amplified to turn everyday behaviors into offenses that could be called out, shamed, or even punished in public spaces or through formal systems. And that created an environment where men began to feel like walking targets in their own daily lives. In courtrooms, especially in matters of family and divorce, the scales tipped heavily in directions that left many men stripped of assets, stability, and access to their own children after years of building something meaningful. And that reality repeated itself often enough that word spread through quiet conversations among men who saw friends, brothers, and coworkers go through the grinder and emerge broken or broke or both. Women dressed in ways that drew attention in gyms, public transport, and everyday settings, then turned around and recorded or accused men for simply existing in the same space or daring to make eye contact or speak a neutral word. And those videos spread online, turning minor moments into public trials that damaged reputations without due process or context. Paternity issues became another layer where trust eroded because stories circulated of men discovering after years that they had supported children who were not biologically theirs, while the systems in place offered little recourse and plenty of ongoing obligation. Victim narratives gained traction that positioned women as perpetual targets, needing protection and resources, while casting men as default villains whose role was to provide, apologize, and step aside when told. Dating itself turned into a lopsided transaction where men were expected to plan cover costs and perform without any guarantee of genuine connection or reciprocity, and groups formed online where private details about men were shared, rated, and weaponized to influence social and professional circles long after any interaction ended. All of this accumulated like layers of sediment building up until men who once tried to navigate the landscape with good intentions simply stopped trying to play a game where the rules changed midstream and the penalties for missteps were disproportionately severe. They listened to the messages telling them they were not needed, they were toxic, they should step back and give space. And eventually, they did exactly that, not out of spite, but out of a clear eyed recognition that continuing to invest time, energy, and resources into dynamics that drained them without replenishing anything meaningful was no longer a viable path. Once that decision took hold, something shifted. Inside many men, They began to experience a kind of clarity that comes when external noise quiets down and they could focus on their own internal compass. Being alone stopped feeling like a punishment and started feeling like a choice that brought actual peace rather than the constant low level anxiety of trying to meet expectations that kept moving further out of reach. Relationships that once seemed like the natural next step in life began to look shallow when examined closely because they often revolved around validation, attention, and material exchanges rather than mutual building or genuine partnership. And men who had spent years providing, protecting, and problem solving realized they could redirect that same effort toward their own stability and interests with far better returns. Minimalism came naturally to many of them, not as some trendy lifestyle, but as a practical way to strip away what no longer served them and keep only what added real value to their days, whether that was time for hobbies, skill building, rest, or simple comforts that cost little but delivered consistent satisfaction. In the process, they rediscovered parts of themselves that had been sidelined for years: the ability to enjoy silence, the freedom to make decisions without negotiation, the satisfaction of keeping what they earned rather than watching it flow outward to support lifestyles or expectations that offered no lasting upside. For generations, men had positioned themselves as buffers, standing between harsh realities and those who depended on them, absorbing shocks and smoothing edges so others could move through life with less friction. But that protective role came with assumptions that were no longer honored or even acknowledged in many circles. Those days ended not with fanfare, but with a quiet collective withdrawal, and now the consequences are playing out in plain sight through endless streams of content where women express shock, confusion, and frustration at how difficult daily life and social connections have become without that buffer in place. They talk about the weight of handling everything solo, the unexpected expenses, the lack of someone to share burdens with, the quiet evenings that stretch longer at Tuam than anticipated, and the realization that independence, which sounded empowering in theory, carries a heavier load in practice when there is no complementary support network stepping up. Men, on the other hand, report lower stress levels, clearer focus, and a sense of control that comes from no longer pouring resources into situations that frequently ended in loss or resentment. They keep their earnings direct, their time toward pursuits that recharge them, and build lives that feel sustainable rather than constantly on the edge of disruption. And that shift is visible in smaller ways to fewer men initiating conversations in social settings, fewer committing to expensive outings or ongoing financial gestures, and more men simply opting for routines that prioritize their own well being over the pursuit of approval or a connection that once defined much of their adult lives. Pattern recognition kicked in hard once men started comparing notes and observing repeated outcomes rather than listening to reassurances that things would improve if they just tried harder or gave more. They saw the discrepancy between words and actions, the promises of equality paired with expectations of traditional provision, the calls for men to be vulnerable, followed by criticism when they expressed genuine concerns, and the celebration of female independence alongside demands that men still fill provider protector roles when convenient. That gap became impossible to ignore, and once trust in the overall framework eroded, the logical response was to step back and invest elsewhere where returns were more predictable and less fraught with hidden costs. Society as a whole is feeling the ripple effects because when a large segment of the population that historically drove much of the initiative in building families, providing stability, and engaging in communal efforts withdraws, the vacuum does not fill itself overnight. Women who once held strong leverage in the dating and marriage markets through youth fertility and social expectations now find those advantages diminishing with time, while the pool of willing participants on the other side has shrunk dramatically, and the complaints about impossible standards, unrealistic demands, and lack of viable options are becoming louder and more frequent. Some express genuine bewilderment at how quickly the landscape changed. Others double down on the same approaches that contributed to the shift. And a growing number are confronting the biological and practical timelines that no amount of messaging can override. Fertility windows close careers that demanded total focus, leave less room for late course corrections. And the social circles that once provided constant validation thin out as peers pair off or move into different life stages. Men who have walked away are not sitting in isolation stewing in anger. They are often living quieter, more intentional lives, enjoying the luxury of time that is not scheduled around someone else's needs or moods, the comfort of spaces that remain undisturbed, and the freedom to pursue interests, hobbies, or simple rest without the mental load of constant negotiation or performance. They have internalized the lesson that their value does not depend on external validation from relationships that frequently demanded more than they returned, and that self acceptance brings a stability that no partner can grant or take away. This is not a story of hatred or retreat in defeat. It is a story of adaptation and boundary setting after years of signals that the old contract was no longer honored by all parties. The economic side cannot be overlooked either because the costs associated with traditional relationship paths have climbed while the perceived benefits have declined in the eyes of many men. Housing requirements, car expectations, wedding expenses, child rearing projections, and the long term financial risks tied to potential dissolution of partnerships all add up to a calculation where the numbers simply do not favor participation for a growing number of average men who see their disposable income better used for personal security rather than funding a system that often leaves them exposed. In places where cultural traditions still emphasize heavy contributions from men toward marriage setups, the withdrawal is even more pronounced as ordinary earners realize they cannot compete with inflated benchmarks or absorb the downside if things do not last. Women in their 30s and beyond who delayed settling down in favor of career exploration travel or waiting for an ideal match that aligned with elevated criteria now face a market where their options have narrowed, not because of some conspiracy, but because time and choices have real consequences that biology and human preferences do not negotiate away. Men across cultures are noticing similar patterns, whether in high pressure economies where financial burdens make family formation prohibitive, or in more relaxed settings where the social and legal risks outweigh the emotional rewards, and the response is consistent: a collective opting out that prioritizes self preservation over continuation of cycles that have proven costly. This departure is reshaping everything from housing markets to consumer trends to social norms because when men stop pursuing, stop committing, and stop filling the traditional roles, the downstream effects touch everything from birth rates to workforce dynamics to the way public spaces function without the same level of male initiative or presence. Women who once benefited from being approached, courted, and provided for now navigate environments where that energy has been redirected inward, and the resulting loneliness or frustration is not met with the same sympathy it might have received in earlier eras because the narrative of perpetual victimhood has worn thin against observable outcomes. Men are not announcing their exit with grand declarations. They are simply living differently, focusing on fitness skills, finances, and hobbies that deliver measurable progress and satisfaction without the volatility that often accompanied interpersonal dynamics. The peace they describe comes from alignment between effort and reward rather than the constant recalibration required to meet shifting expectations. And that alignment feels restorative after years of being told their instincts were suspect, their contributions insufficient, and their presence optional. Society told men for a long time that they could be replaced or improved upon. And when they took that message at face value and stepped aside, the absence created a void that is now impossible to deny or fill with slogans alone. What we are witnessing is a large scale recalibration where men are choosing observable reality over promised futures that failed to materialize. And that choice is leading them toward lives that feel lighter, more controlled, and ultimately more aligned with their nature as beings who thrive when they can direct their own path without endless external interference or criticism. Women who find themselves on the other side of this shift are confronting the gap between the independence they championed and the practical realities of navigating life without the complementary strengths that men once brought to the table. And many are voicing that gap in raw terms through conversations about exhaustion, isolation, and the unexpected weight of carrying every responsibility solo. The stories emerging show women in their late 30s, 40s, and beyond realizing that the years spent building careers or enjoying freedom without long term anchors have left them in positions where forming new connections or families faces steeper biological, social, and logistical hurdles than anticipated. And the men who might have been available earlier have either paired off, built independent lives, or simply lost interest in investing where past patterns suggest high risk for low return. This is not about assigning blame in a simplistic way. It is about acknowledging cause and effect chains that have played out over decades and the human cost on both sides when foundational assumptions about roles, reciprocity, and responsibility erode without replacement structures that actually work. Men who once absorbed societal pressures and buffered others from them are now applying that same protective instinct to themselves and their own futures. And that redirection, while sobering for the broader culture, is bringing many of them a level of contentment that was missing when they were constantly positioned as the fixers, providers, and scapegoats in equal measure. They are minimalist, not out of deprivation, but out of wisdom, stripping away obligations that drained without replenishing and focusing energy on elements that compound positively over time, whether that is physical health, financial independence, skill development, or simple daily rhythms that restore rather than deplete. In doing so, they are modeling a different kind of strength, one rooted in self knowledge and boundary enforcement rather than endless accommodation. And that model is quietly influencing others who see the results in real time through improved focus, reduced anxiety, and a sense of agency that no external relationship has been able to consistently provide. The hard hitting part that many are still coming to terms with is that this walk away is not a phase. It is a response to cumulative experience. And once men internalize the lesson that their peace is worth protecting above all else, reversing course becomes unlikely because the alternative has been tested and found wanting in too many repeated instances. Women who pushed for changes in how relationships and society functioned did so with the belief that new arrangements would deliver better outcomes, but the data points accumulating through personal accounts, economic trends, and shifting participation rates tell a different story. One where the removal of male engagement in traditional capacities has left gaps that are difficult to bridge with careers, social media, or self affirmation alone. The attention that once flowed toward building joint futures is now conserved for personal stability, and that conservation feels like luxury to men who spent years spreading themselves thin to meet demands that never seem fully satisfied. They see through the cycles of chaos created for validation or leverage, and they choose instead the steady ground of routines that they control and outcomes they can predict. And that choice is reshaping their days in ways that feel restorative and sustainable. Every day brings more examples of women confronting the practical limits of going it alone, whether through financial strain, emotional fatigue, or the simple absence of shared decision making and support during challenging periods. And those examples serve as quiet confirmation to the men who have already stepped back that their decision was grounded in reality rather than reaction. The game, as many men describe it, was structured in ways that favored short term extraction over long term mutual benefit. And once that structure became clear, the rational move was to stop playing rather than continue losing ground. Trust shifted from words and social pressures to direct observation of patterns, and the patterns showed that investing heavily in relationships often led to asset division, ongoing obligations, and emotional drain, while stepping back preserved resources, energy, and mental clarity. This is the sobering wake up that cannot be messaged away or reframed because it rests on lived experience repeated across enough lives that it has become a recognizable movement, even if it lacks formal organization or public spokesman. Men are thriving in their own lanes, not because they hate the other side, but because they have made peace with the fact that certain paths no longer align with self preservation and genuine happiness, and that peace allows them to live lighter without the constant undercurrent of negotiation or performance that defined earlier attempts at connection. The luxury they describe is not material excess, but the freedom from. Hey guys, in a world pushing you to own nothing and be happy, crypto is your key to survival. Join Angry's Crypto Academy to master buying, selling, and trading crypto. Make huge profits and safeguard your wealth. Plus, discover the one crypto virtually no one is talking about, poised to create new millionaires in the upcoming bull run. The link is in the description of the video below. Go check it out now. Unnecessary complications, the ability to rest when needed, the choice to pursue what genuinely interests them, and the security of knowing their efforts stay with them rather than being redirected into systems that offered uncertain returns. Rediscovering themselves means reconnecting with instincts that were once labeled problematic and finding that those instincts, when directed inward, lead to better personal outcomes than when constantly filtered through external expectations. Society as a whole is adjusting to a reality where the traditional buffers and initiators have largely withdrawn, and that adjustment is forcing a confrontation with the true costs of the shifts that were celebrated for years, without fully accounting for the downstream effects on stability, family formation, and interpersonal dynamics. Women who once told men to go away or that they were not needed are now experiencing the full weight of what that departure actually means in practical everyday terms, and the resulting conversations reveal a mixture of regret, frustration, and attempts to reframe the situation that do not always land with the same persuasive power they once held. Men on their side are not gloating or returning to old patterns. They are simply continuing to build lives that make sense for them, and that continuation is proving more fulfilling than the alternative ever did. This is cast the raw truth of where things stand, and it serves as a clear signal that change, when pushed too far in one direction, eventually produces counter movements that reshape the landscape in lasting ways, and the men who have walked away embody that reshaping through their daily choices and their refusal to re enter dynamics that previously cost them too much for too little. The patterns of demonization in media education and public discourse created an atmosphere where boys and men grew up hearing that their masculinity was suspect, their presence potentially harmful, and their contributions conditional on constant self improvement or apology. And that atmosphere took its toll until enough of them reached an age where they could look back and decide the cost of conforming was higher than the benefit of opting out. Courts became arenas where outcomes often favored one side in ways that left the other bearing long term burdens. And that disparity repeated enough times that men began to view legal partnership as a high stakes gamble rather than a stable foundation. Public shaming through recordings and online amplification turned minor interactions into career or reputation risks, and that risk environment made casual or spontaneous engagement feel unwise at best and dangerous at worst. Expectations around provision and performance remained high, even as messages of equality suggested otherwise, creating a double bind where men were told to treat women as equals while still being held to provider standards in practice. And that inconsistency eroded motivation to engage. The realization that being alone did not equate to loneliness came as a revelation to many because it allowed space for self reflection without the noise of constant criticism or unmet demands. And in that space, men found they could build contentment from within rather than seeking it externally in relationships that frequently introduced more variables than solutions. Female nature, as observed through repeated interactions, showed tendencies toward creating drama for attention or testing boundaries in ways that drained energy without building anything durable. And men who recognized those patterns chose to remove themselves from the cycle rather than continue participating in it. Focusing on personal happiness meant simplifying life, removing obligations that did not serve, and investing in elements that delivered consistent positive returns. And that approach aligned well with male tendencies toward problem solving and efficiency once the external pressures were set aside. The minimalist shift was not about deprivation, it was about clarity, keeping what mattered and releasing what had become weight, and that clarity brought a form of luxury that many described as the ability to breathe and direct their own days without external oversight. Protecting women from harsh realities had been a default role for generations, but when that role was no longer appreciated or reciprocated, and instead met with criticism or legal disadvantages, the protective instinct turned inward toward self and immediate circle. And that turn has proven sustainable for those who made it. TikTok streams and social content now overflow with accounts of women struggling with survival aspects that once seemed manageable when dual contributions or male initiative were more common, and those accounts serve as real time documentation of the vacuum left behind. Men are no longer defaulting to asking out, paying for, or supporting in the ways they once did, because the return on that investment has been observed to be low or negative in too many cases, and instead they are channeling resources toward self preservation and personal interests that yield better long term stability. The game being rigged became obvious through pattern after pattern, where words promised fairness, but actions and outcomes favored extraction. And once that became clear, trust shifted entirely to what could be seen and verified rather than what was claimed or demanded. Women who created or amplified the conditions for this withdrawal through consistent messaging and behaviors now face the results of men actually listening and acting on what they heard. And the absence is creating ripples that touch everything from personal happiness to broader societal functioning. Men are thriving in simplicity because they have removed the chaos and retained the control, and that thriving looks like restful nights, focused days, and a sense of peace that comes from no longer being the constant fixer in situations that rarely stayed fixed. The conclusion that lands hardest is that the men are gone from the old dynamics and they are not returning because the cost was too high, the rewards too uncertain, and the peace they found in stepping back too valuable to trade away again. And that reality is what women and society at large are now forced to confront in the days and years ahead. This first section lays out the foundation of how we reach this point and the immediate human impacts. But there is far more ground to cover in understanding the depth of these shifts, the specific mechanisms that accelerated the walkaway, and the long term implications for everyone involved. The economic calculations alone deserve close examination because when men run the numbers on marriage, dating, and family formation in the current environment, the math frequently shows negative expected value, and that calculation is driving decisions at scale. High costs for housing, vehicles, weddings, and child rearing, combined with elevated probabilities of asset division, ongoing support payments, and limited access to children in dissolution scenarios. And the result is a risk profile that many rational actors choose to avoid entirely. In cultures with heavy bride price or dowry expectations, the burden falls even more directly on men making entry into family life, prohibitive for average earners who see their lifetime earnings better allocated toward personal security rather than one sided investments. Consumerism has inflated every aspect of relationship milestones, turning what were once communal or modest steps into high stakes financial commitments that benefit industries more than the participants, and men who recognize this dynamic are opting out of the consumer trap altogether. Divorce statistics and anecdotal outcomes from family courts reinforce the perception that the legal framework treats men as disposable resources rather than equal partners. And that perception is backed by enough real cases that it has become a standard consideration before any commitment is made. False accusation risks amplified by movements that prioritized immediate belief over due process added another layer of caution, making even innocent interactions feel like potential minefields, and men responded by reducing interactions in professional, social, and public settings to minimize exposure. The judicial system in multiple domains became a tool for extraction rather than resolution, and stories of men losing homes, savings, and parental rights while still facing financial obligations circulated widely enough to serve as cautionary tales for entire generations. Women who use public shaming tactics through recordings and online posts created an environment where men learned to document their own behavior or simply avoid situations where they could be mischaracterized, and that learning curve accelerated the retreat from mixed spaces. Paternity fraud cases where men discovered discrepancies after years of support highlighted trust issues that no amount of reassurance could fully repair, and the legal remedies available often left men with ongoing responsibilities despite the biological reality. Victim culture positioned women as needing constant advocacy and resources while framing men as default sources of that support, and that framing ignored the vulnerabilities men faced in silence until enough of them began speaking openly about their experiences in private circles. The demand for expensive dates with low probability of genuine connection turned courtship into a financial filter that many men eventually refused to pass through, especially when the end result was often ghosting, rejection, or platonic outcomes after significant investment. Groups dedicated to sharing negative information about men amplified reputational risks, making dating feel like entering a arena where past actions could be weaponized indefinitely. And that environment discouraged participation from men who valued their privacy and stability. The cumulative effect of these elements was a slow boil that eventually reached a tipping point where men as a group decided the downside outweighed any potential upside, and the walk away began in earnest, not as organized protest, but as individual choices compounding into a noticeable trend. Once men made peace with themselves and accepted their own company as sufficient, the shallowness of many relationships became starkly apparent because those relationships often centered on what the man could provide or perform rather than mutual growth or genuine companionship. The claim that a woman's presence alone constituted the table rang hollow when examined against the reality of one sided expectations, and men who saw through that claim redirected their energy toward building tables for themselves that actually held weight. Female nature observed without the filter of idealization revealed tendencies to introduce chaos for attention, validation, or control. And men who recognized those tendencies chose to exit the arena rather than continue engaging in cycles that rarely resolved productively. Happiness for many men now comes from simple, reliable routines, physical activity, skill, acquisition, financial discipline, and the freedom to say no without guilt or explanation. And that happiness is proving more durable than the temporary highs of relationships that required constant maintenance. Luxury in this context is the ability to wake up without dread, the option to rest when needed, and the security of resources that remain under personal control rather than subject to division or demand. And men are embracing that luxury after years of spreading themselves across obligations that offered diminishing returns. Rediscovering themselves means reconnecting with curiosity, competence, and calm that were often suppressed under layers of performance and criticism, and that reconnection is yielding lives that feel authentic rather than scripted. The protective role men once filled is no longer extended outward in the same way because the recipients of that protection frequently turned around and criticized or legally disadvantaged the protector, and self protection has become the new priority with positive effects on mental and financial health. Content from women highlighting survival struggles, begging for renewed male participation, or demanding attention serves as unintended confirmation that the withdrawal has real world consequences, and men who see that content are reinforced in their decision to maintain distance. No longer sending resources or attention to profiles that link financial requests or expecting nothing in return has freed up significant mental and monetary bandwidth for men who now direct it towards self improvement or simple enjoyment. Trusting pattern recognition over smooth words has become a survival skill, and the patterns have shown consistent outcomes that favor caution over engagement. Seeing through games' lies and manipulated narratives has led men to rely solely on what can be directly observed and verified. And that reliance has brought clarity that was missing when they operated on trust alone. Women who pushed boundaries for years without anticipating the breaking point now face the reality that the men they dismissed or mistreated have built lives without them, and those lives are often functioning better than the chaotic alternatives they left behind. Society is collapsing in slow motion in areas where male disengagement removes the traditional drivers of initiative, stability, and provision. And women are experiencing that collapse most acutely in their personal circumstances, while men are largely insulated by their focus on self preservation. The men are thriving because they kept what they earned, rested when needed, and stopped worrying about expenses or expectations that were never reciprocated in kind. And that thriving is visible in their calm demeanor, improved health, and refusal to re enter the old cycles. This is the unvarnished truth of the situation, and it serves as a wake up call that cannot be dismissed because the evidence is in the lived experiences of millions who have chosen a different path and found it superior to the one they were expected to follow. Continuing from here, the depth of these changes reveals itself in the specific ways men have restructured their daily existence and the broader cultural adjustments that are following in the wake of their departure. Men are embracing routines that prioritize recovery and growth over constant output, and that embrace is leading to higher personal satisfaction levels that they report openly in private discussions. The simplicity of their lives stands in contrast to the complexity they left behind, and that contrast reinforces their commitment to staying the course. Women confronting the point of no return in terms of age, fertility, and social leverage are voicing regrets that range from quiet reflections to public outbursts, and those voices add weight to the narrative that choices have consequences which cannot be negotiated away after the fact. The mass walk away was not sudden. It was the end result of incremental erosions of trust and value that accumulated until the scale tipped decisively. And once it tipped, the momentum carried many men into a new chapter where peace became the primary goal. Feminism as a force spent decades framing masculinity as problematic and in need of correction, and that framing influenced education, policy, media, and legal standards in ways that left men feeling like second class participants in their own societies. The invention of terms designed to pathologize natural male behavior created a climate of constant self monitoring that eventually exhausted many and led them to disengage from environments where they felt policed rather than respected. Judicial systems in family, civil, and criminal matters developed reputations for outcomes that disproportionately burdened men with financial and emotional costs, and those reputations spread through word of mouth and shared experiences until avoidance became the default strategy. Chaos introduced in relationships through testing behaviors, drama creation, or attention seeking strategies drained men who sought stability, and they responded by removing themselves from the source of the chaos. Harassment claims based on innocuous interactions in gyms or public spaces combined with inappropriate attire that drew attention, then punished it for being noticed, added layers of risk that made casual engagement feel unwise. Smartphone recordings turned everyday moments into potential viral condemnations, and that potential risk made men more guarded in public, leading to fewer spontaneous interactions and a general withdrawal from mixed social settings. Paternity issues, where trust was violated without adequate recourse, created deep skepticism about long term commitments and the legal obligations that could follow even after deception was revealed. Victim positioning that granted privileges while assigning villain roles to men ignored the real struggles men faced, and that imbalance contributed to resentment that eventually manifested as disengagement rather than confrontation. Messages telling men to never approach or to accept rejection gracefully without complaint were taken literally, and the result was a dating market where initiative from men dropped sharply, leaving women to navigate the consequences of reduced pursuit. Free meal expectations and high cost dates with low commitment probability turned courtship into an expensive filter that many men eventually refused to engage with, especially when the outcome was frequently platonic or abrupt. Groups and apps designed to share information about men created reputational minefields that discouraged participation from those who valued their good names and professional standing. The evil and vile actions as perceived by men accumulated into a body of evidence that could no longer be ignored, and the response was a collective learning process that led to the walkaway as a form of self defense and self respect. Men realized that being alone offered peace that relationships often disrupted, and that realization was liberating because it removed the pressure to perform for approval that rarely lasted. Self acceptance allowed men to see their own worth independent of external validation, and that sight shifted their priorities toward internal development rather than external conquest or provision. The shallowness of many relationships became apparent when stripped of the provider role, and men saw that their contributions were often taken for granted or used as leverage rather than appreciated as partnership. The claim that a woman's presence was sufficient rang false against the reality of demands for resources, attention, and emotional labor without equivalent return, and men who recognized that falsehood chose to build sufficiency for themselves. Female nature, when observed closely, showed patterns of chaos creation for validation, and men who saw those patterns chose to exit rather than manage them indefinitely. Focusing on personal happiness meant identifying what truly brought joy and removing what did not. And that focus led to lives of quiet luxury defined by comfort, control, and contentment rather than drama and depletion. Minimalism came naturally because men tend toward efficiency. And once they applied that efficiency to their personal lives, the excess fell away, leaving space for what mattered. Removing unnecessary elements allowed energy to flow toward pursuits that compounded happiness over time, and that redirection felt like rediscovery of their core selves. The days of shielding others from reality ended when the shielded turned the protection into criticism or legal disadvantage, and self shielding became the new priority with beneficial results for mental, financial, and emotional health. Content showing women struggling with basic survival or demanding male return serves as real time feedback that the withdrawal has impact, and men use that feedback to affirm their choice to stay the course. No longer providing attention, time, or money to those who offer little in return has freed resources for self investment, and that freedom is delivering returns that feel tangible and sustainable. The game being rigged became undeniable through repeated observation, and men now trust their own eyes over societal scripts or persuasive language. Seeing through lies and manipulations has led to a reliance on observable reality that cuts through noise and brings clarity to decision making. Women who screwed up by pushing too far and too consistently now face the absence of the men they once relied upon, and that absence is forcing a confrontation with the consequences of their actions. Men who are gone are building lives of self preservation and personal happiness that do not include the old roles, and that building is proving resilient against external pressure to return. Society collapsing under the weight of reduced male participation is a slow process, but the effects are felt most by those who previously benefited from it without acknowledging the cost, and men are largely insulated by their focus on internal stability. Thriving in simplicity is the new normal for many men, and that thriving includes rest without guilt, focus without distraction, and peace without the need to manage someone else's chaos. The men are not coming back because the peace they found is too valuable and the risks of re engagement too high. And that reality is the sobering conclusion that frames the current landscape. This narrative continues to unfold as more men reach the same conclusions through their own experiences. And the cumulative effect is a cultural shift that cannot be reversed by appeals or demands alone. The depth of the walk away reveals itself in the quiet lives men are living and the growing awareness among women that the old dynamics have fundamentally changed. Men have internalized the lessons of the past 50 years and applied them by stepping back. And that step back has created space for self reflection and growth that was previously crowded out by external demands. The authoritative truth is that actions have consequences, and the consequences of decades of pushing men to the margins are now visible in the empty spaces they once filled and the peace they have claimed for themselves. The raw reality is that men learn to value their own peace above societal expectations, and that valuation has led to a mass reorientation of priorities that favors self over service in relationships that no longer feel mutual. This is the wake up call that echoes through the current moment, and it demands attention because the trends are accelerating rather than slowing, and the outcomes are reshaping lives on a large scale. Men who once tried to make it work despite the obstacles eventually reached their limit, and the limit looked like choosing solitude over subjugation and peace over performance. Women who passed the point of no return in terms of age and options are now confronting the results of their choices. And that confrontation is often uncomfortable because it requires acknowledging the role their own actions played in the current imbalance. The mass focus on male peace is not a temporary reaction. It is a sustained adaptation to conditions that made continued participation irrational, and that adaptation is holding firm because the benefits are real and the alternatives have been tested. Simple lives of luxury and comfort for men mean different things to different individuals. But the common thread is control over their own resources, time, and energy without the drain of one sided dynamics. Minimalist by nature, Once freed from external clutter, men are curating existences that align with their strengths, and that curation is yielding higher satisfaction than the complicated arrangements they left behind. Rediscovering themselves is an ongoing process of shedding old programming and embracing natural inclinations that were previously suppressed, and that process is bringing many men a sense of authenticity they had not experienced in years. The buffer role is over, and the self focus that replaced it is proving protective and productive, leading to better personal outcomes that men are reluctant to trade away. Every day, more examples emerge of women facing the practical difficulties of life without the traditional male contributions. And those examples reinforce the decision men have made to prioritize their own survival and happiness. Trusting pattern recognition has become second nature, and the patterns point clearly toward disengagement as the safest and most rewarding path. The rigged nature of the old game is no longer debatable in the minds of those who have walked away. And that lack of debate solidifies their commitment to staying gone. Women who created the conditions for this outcome through consistent behaviors and messaging are now living with the results, and the results include increased difficulty in forming stable connections or securing the support they once took for granted. Men thriving while keeping their money resting without worry and focusing on self preservation represent a fundamental shift in how resources and energy are allocated, and that shift is not reversing. The conclusion that the men are gone and not coming back is hard but accurate, based on the observable trends and the personal accounts from both sides, and it serves as the foundation for understanding where things stand and where they are likely headed. This is the straightforward accounting of the situation without sugarcoating or evasion, and it lays the groundwork for deeper exploration of the mechanisms, the impacts, and the long term consequences that are still unfolding. The story of men walking away is one of quiet determination after years of accumulated experience, and that determination is reshaping personal lives and cultural norms in ways that will be felt for generations. Men have chosen to focus on what they can control, and that choice is delivering peace that was elusive when they operated under the old rules. Women facing the point of no return are learning that time and biology do not pause for social movements, and that lesson is coming at a cost that many did not anticipate when they pushed for changes without considering the full picture. The wake up call is here, and it is sobering because it reveals the limits of ideology when confronted with human nature reality and the choices individuals make when given the freedom to step back. Men are not looking back because the view forward is clearer and more promising on their own terms. And that clarity is what defines the current moment. This narrative builds from the core premise and continues to unpack the layers with each passing development, adding weight to the overall truth that the shift is real. The consequences are mounting, and the men who have walked away are committed to their path of peace and self determination. The intensity of the push from one side met the limit of tolerance on the other, and the resulting separation is now a defining feature of the landscape that cannot be undone by wishes or words alone. Men have learned to value their own well being, and that valuation is the bedrock of their current approach to life. The raw truth is that relationships became transactions that favored one side too consistently, and men responded by exiting the transaction entirely. Peace is the prize they claim, and it is a prize worth protecting. Society is adjusting to the absence, and the adjustment is uneven, with some feeling the loss more acutely than others. This is the beginning of a longer accounting, and the patterns established here will carry through the full examination of how we arrived at this point and what it means for the future. Men walking away is not the end of the story. It is the start of a new chapter where priorities realign around self respect, sustainability, and observable value rather than outdated expectations or unreciprocated effort. The sobering part is that the changes were decades in the making, and the outcomes are now visible in real time through the choices people are making and the lives they are building or struggling to maintain. Men have found their footing in simplicity, and that footing is firm. Women confronting the new reality are navigating uncharted territory, and the navigation is proving more challenging than anticipated. The authoritative voice of experience from those who have lived through the shift speaks clearly. The men are done with the old dynamic and they are building something different that serves them better. This is the straightforward presentation of the facts as they stand, and it sets the stage for the continued exploration of the depth and breadth of this cultural movement. The hard hitting conclusion that men have walked away and are not looking back is the thread that ties everything together. And it demands attention because it reflects a fundamental change in how men and women relate to each other and to society at large. The peace men have found is not fragile, it is earned through hard lessons, and it is not easily surrendered. The point of no return for many women is a biological and social reality that no amount of denial can erase. And the men who have stepped back are living proof that alternatives exist and are preferable for those who choose them. This is the wake up call, delivered in clear terms, without embellishment or evasion. And it serves as the foundation for everything that follows in understanding the full scope of the situation. Men have walked away focusing on their peace, and that focus is reshaping their lives in positive ways while leaving the broader culture to adjust to the consequences. The truth is straightforward: the push went too far. The response was measured, and the outcome is a separation that is likely permanent for many. The luxury of simple living is real for those who embrace it, and men are embracing it with both hands after years of carrying loads that were not appreciated or reciprocated. Rediscovering themselves is an ongoing journey that brings rewards the old path never delivered. The buffer is gone, and self protection is the new standard, and that standard is holding strong. Every example of struggle on the other side reinforces the decision, and the reinforcement is constant. The game is seen for what it was, and the decision to stop playing is final for those who have made it. Women who pushed until the breaking point are now living with the break, and the living is harder than expected. Men thriving in their own way are the evidence that the choice was sound, and that evidence is accumulating daily. This is the narrative as it stands, and it continues to unfold with each new observation and each new choice. The sobering wake up is that the men are gone and the world is different because of it. And adapting to that difference is the task at hand for everyone involved. The raw reality is that trust, once broken, is not easily restored, and the trust that was broken through decades of actions has led to a withdrawal that is deep and wide. Peace is the reward, and men are claiming it without apology. The authoritative truth is that this is where things stand, and ignoring it will not make it disappear. This lays the groundwork for the full examination, and the patterns established will carry through the remainder with consistent focus on the causes, the effects, and the human realities at play. Men have walked away, and they are not looking back because the view from their new position is clearer and more sustainable than the one they left behind. The end of the old dynamic is not a loss for men, it is a gain in autonomy and peace. And that gain is what they are protecting with their continued disengagement. Women facing the consequences are learning lessons that were available earlier but often ignored, and the learning is coming at a personal cost. Society is feeling the shift in subtle and not so subtle ways. And the shift is permanent because the underlying conditions that caused it have not been addressed in ways that would encourage return. The men are focused on self, and that focus is delivering results that speak for themselves. This is the truthful accounting, and it sets the tone for the deeper dive that follows. The intensity of the original push met the boundary of male tolerance, and the boundary held, leading to the current separation. Peace is the prize, and it is being defended. The point of no return is real, and it is being felt by those who reached it without preparation. The mass walk away is the response, and the response is rational based on experience. Simple lives of luxury mean different things, but the common benefit is freedom from unnecessary burden. Minimalism serves efficiency, and efficiency serves happiness. Rediscovery brings strength that was latent. The buffer role ended and self role began with positive effect. The examples of struggle confirm the choice. Pattern recognition guides the path. The rigged game is avoided. The lies are seen through. The men are gone, and the absence is felt. Thriving in peace is the new normal. The conclusion stands firm. Men have observed the economic pressures stacking up in places like China, where marriage has turned into a heavy financial transaction that ordinary working men simply cannot sustain without going deep into debt or sacrificing their entire future security. Houses, cars, bride prices, and the full list of expected assets create a barrier so high that many men look at the numbers and decide the gamble is not worth taking, especially when divorce rates and asset division lean heavily against them in the long run. Women there in their mid 30s who once followed advice to chase careers and independence now find themselves lowering standards dramatically, hoping for basic compatibility through family networks and blind dates. Yet the pool of willing men has shrunk because those men have calculated the costs and chosen to keep their resources for themselves instead of funding lifestyles that offer uncertain stability. One woman with advanced degrees and a solid professional background admits she missed the window when her options were broadest and now faces the reality that her market value has shifted while men her age or younger prioritize freedom over obligation. Another in her late 30s talks openly about the fear of aging alone without the support system she once assumed would be there. And she has dropped demands for luxury items, realizing that even modest expectations meet resistance from men who have watched friends and relatives lose everything in similar arrangements. These stories repeat across cultures, but the pattern holds steady. Men see the transaction for what it is and they step back, preserving their earnings for personal stability, travel savings, or simple daily comfort, rather than pouring them into setups that carry high probability of loss. In Western contexts, the same calculation plays out through survival mode, where men juggle multiple jobs just to cover basics like rent, food, and transportation, leaving zero bandwidth for the time, energy, and money that modern dating demands. Courting feels like a part time job on top of an already exhausting schedule. And when men reach their late 30s, they notice their drive for constant pursuit has naturally decreased, making the endless cycle of starting over even less appealing. Relationships that last only a year or two require reintroducing yourself, courting again, and investing emotionally, only to face the same risks of quick dissolution. And men who have been through it multiple times decide the juice is simply not worth the squeeze. They love women in the abstract and remain polite in everyday interactions, but they no longer feel compelled to chase or perform when the return is exhaustion drama and potential financial exposure. Peace becomes the priority. A quiet evening without the mental load of managing someone else's happiness or navigating shifting expectations feels restorative. After years of being told they must provide effort without reciprocal understanding of their constraints. Women complain about lack of initiative, yet overlook how the economy and daily grind have placed men in positions where dating is a luxury they cannot afford without sacrificing their own baseline security. The loneliness that surfaces in women's conversations now often stems from carrying every responsibility solo after years of messaging that independence would bring fulfillment. Evenings stretch longer without shared routines. Small tasks feel heavier without complementary support. And the silence that once seemed empowering starts to weigh on daily life. Many women in their 30s and 40s describe the sadness of weekends spent alone at the gym or handling errands without a partner to share the load, and they express confusion about why genuine connections feel scarce. Men on the other side have adapted by focusing inward, building routines that deliver consistent satisfaction without the volatility of mismatched expectations or one sided emotional labor. Social media has accelerated the awareness on both sides by exposing patterns that were once hidden in private circles. Women who spent their 20s prioritizing casual experiences or high standards later confront the reduced options as men gravitate toward partners who bring softness, reciprocity, and lower drama rather than established independence that comes with rigid boundaries. The wall, as it is described, hits when biological timelines and accumulated choices narrow the field, and men who once overlooked red flags for the sake of connection now apply stricter filters based on observed outcomes. They see entitlement in demands for chivalry without equivalent effort or respect, and they choose not to engage rather than risk becoming another story of unappreciated investment. Nice guys, the steady, reliable types who previously absorbed disrespect or bare minimum treatment have reached their limit as well. They recognize that relationships framed as traps, where marriage brings the threat of asset loss, child access, restrictions, and ongoing obligations, no longer align with rational self interest. Boundary enforcement becomes key. They refuse to navigate contradictory signals, be subtle but obvious pursue, but do not pressure, provide, but expect nothing in return, and instead they walk away from the maze entirely. Hypocrisy stands out when women who once dismissed good men as boring or insufficient later express shock that even those men have disengaged, and the mirror held up reveals discomfort on the receiving end of the same casual rejection. Risk assessment drives much of the withdrawal because family courts and legal frameworks carry reputations for outcomes that leave men exposed while protecting the other side, and stories of false accusations or sudden shifts in domestic situations circulate enough to make caution the default. Men assume potential danger in interactions not out of paranoia, but from repeated examples where words alone could trigger severe consequences, and they protect their peace by minimizing exposure. Nose rings or certain signals become quick filters for some, but the deeper filter is the overall pattern of behavior that suggests high maintenance, low reciprocity, and elevated risk. In 2025, the refusal to go out or initiate has become noticeable enough that women voice panic over the lack of traditional courtship gestures like planning dates, buying flowers, or taking the lead, and men respond that they are simply applying the equality that was demanded. If roles are truly balanced, then the expectation for men to always chase, provide, and absorb the effort falls away. And many welcome the removal of that burden, choosing instead to stay home focused on personal growth or enjoy low key hobbies without the pressure of performance. Feminism's influence is credited with shifting women away from traditional feminine strengths toward independence that solves survival needs but leaves emotional voids unaddressed, and men point out that accountability for those choices has been slow to arrive. Women who once celebrated not needing men now find that emotional connection and shared life remain deeply human desires that careers or social circles do not fully replace, and the resulting frustration surfaces in complaints about men who text without following through or who refuse to invest without clear mutual interest. Men counter that they have seen the lack of reciprocity, the demands for upgrades without contribution, and the tendency to devalue steady partners in favor of excitement, and they have adapted by withholding the chase entirely. Introverted men minding their own business become invisible to women seeking outgoing initiators, Yet those same women sometimes express preferences for quiet types while failing to create the safe space for approach. Clubs and party scenes are dismissed as unlikely places to find stable partners, and advice circles back to self elevation and realistic expectations rather than waiting for fantasy men to appear. Men who have gone their own way for decades report exquisite peace, with 80% of previous stress evaporating once relationship status stopped dominating their mental space. And they describe solitude as heaven compared to the limbo of mismatched dynamics. The good men listened when told to leave them alone, and they built lives of self reliance that now feel superior to the alternatives. Transactional elements dominate many discussions of marriage where love takes a backseat to house size, car brand salary thresholds, and the full suite of consumerist add ons that inflate costs far beyond what average earners can manage. Capitalism amplifies the pressure by tying affection to gifts, honeymoons, and ongoing displays of spending, and men who reject that model keep their wallets closed, choosing debt free simplicity over competitive consumption. Child rearing projections add millions more in lifetime costs, including education and future uncertainties, making the entire package a losing proposition for those who run the numbers honestly. Successful single men in their 30s with good incomes and assets often cite materialism, instability, and loss of freedom as reasons for staying unattached, and they value travel savings and personal control over the warmth of companionship that comes with heavy strings. Parents pushing traditional scripts about marriage for old age care or homeownership for status meet resistance from younger generations who see the financial infeasibility and prefer autonomy without inherited debt or unrealistic benchmarks. Baristas and delivery workers symbolize the broader grind, where daily survival leaves little room for romance and the stress compounds when societal expectations ignore economic realities. Purity and self respect enter the conversation as ways to maintain personal vitality, arguing that avoiding certain behaviors preserves an attractive energy that draws compatible partners naturally rather than through forced pursuit. Women who regret cohabitation or promiscuity in youth sometimes link those choices to later difficulties in forming stable bonds, and the advice circles toward preserving essence for long term desirability. Blind dates and matchmaking parks overflow with female profiles, while male participation lags, creating visible imbalances that underscore the withdrawal. Men who once brought flowers or planned thoughtful dates stopped when appreciation waned and effort felt one sided, turning courtship from genuine connection into obligatory performance. Hookup culture rewarded short term players, while steady men received criticism for being boring, and the resulting imbalance left many good men guarding their energy for pursuits that actually rewarded investment. Antidepressant use among lonely women highlights the gap between promised empowerment and lived experience, where independence handles logistics but leaves deeper needs for intimacy and partnership unmet. Dating apps amplified ghosting flakiness and the sense of endless options, making genuine exclusivity rare. And men who assess long term potential early often conclude the chances are slim before significant investment. Women in their 40s describe men no longer seeing them the same way. Competition from younger, softer partners increases, and established habits make compromise difficult, leading to further isolation. They watch peers with families while facing quiet evenings or gym routines alone. And the contrast brings moments of raw acknowledgement that choices carried unforeseen costs. Boundary issues compound the problem when signals contradict expectations. Respectful men avoid the maze of mixed messages and opt out rather than risk misinterpretation. Entitlement shows up in demands for wife treatment from strangers or full provision without partnership, and men reject that dynamic, choosing self respect over becoming walking resources. Divorce stories reveal patterns where support withdraws during hardship or expectations remain rigid despite changed circumstances, and those patterns teach men to prioritize protection of what they have built. The nice guys are done absorbing the nonsense because they recognize their own value and refuse to settle for dynamics that devalue stability, kindness, or a consistent effort. They flip the script by treating themselves as the prize, bringing resources and calm to any potential connection, and they walk away when reciprocity is absent. Hypocrisy becomes evident when women who dish out casual judgments struggle to receive similar directness, and the tears or shock that follow reveal the one sided nature of previous interactions. In bars and public spaces, approaches have nearly vanished because the risk of being labeled or facing consequences outweighs any potential reward. And sane men protect themselves by assuming caution across all interactions. Weaponization through certain cultural narratives created an environment where even innocent gestures could escalate, and men learned quickly to disengage entirely. False allegations in various settings, from domestic matters to casual encounters, added to the calculus, making withdrawal the logical defense. Women panic when even basic initiations dry up, and they question what happened to real courtship, yet men point back to the equality they were told to embrace, where responsibilities balance out, and traditional provider roles no longer apply unilaterally. Texting without follow through or casual meetups replace planned efforts because the full investment no longer makes sense in a landscape of high risk, low trust. Men adapt by staying home, enjoying solitude, or pursuing individual goals, and they report reduced stress, clearer focus, and genuine contentment in the absence of relational limbo. The epidemic of loneliness among women traces back to self inflicted drifts from natural complementary roles, where independence solved surface needs but left emotional cores unfulfilled. Society conditioned many to reject the idea of needing anyone, and the resulting isolation feels heavier when daily tasks pile up without shared support. Men do not experience the same intensity because they find fulfillment in self directed lives, and they no longer pedestalize connections that demand constant validation without return. Good men who were once available have grown guarded after repeated devaluation, and they now seek partners who recognize their qualities rather than labeling stability as boring. Hookup culture thrived on rewarding non commitment, while steady types received less appreciation. And the long term result is a dating market skewed toward short term excitement over lasting partnership. Women hitting points where options narrow confront the reality that their best years were sometimes spent in directions that did not build toward family or mutual investment. And the adjustment period brings discomfort that external blame does not fully resolve. Men in survival mode cannot afford the financial or temporal costs of repeated starting over, and they drop expectations for drama free, best friend style connections that align on basics rather than superficial checklists. Arranged marriage concepts from other cultures highlight the value of shared values and family ties over pure romantic pursuit. And some men wonder if modern individualism has sacrificed that practicality for illusory freedom. Libido shifts with age, reduce the urgency of pursuit, making peace a more attractive default than endless chasing. Consumerism tied to love through rings, gifts, and experiences inflates every milestone, turning what could be simple bonds into competitive displays that benefit industries more than participants. Men reject that model, keeping resources for personal security, and men who succeed financially without marriage often cite the freedom from obligations as a key advantage, allowing travel savings and unencumbered decision making. Parental pressures clash with youth realities when down payments or debt for housing feel like traps rather than foundations, and younger generations push back, preferring autonomy. Vitality preservation, through avoiding certain excesses, is presented as a path to maintaining attractiveness and energy that draws compatible matches organically rather than through desperation or lowered standards later in life. Women who regret following independent scripts without balancing long term timelines now actively seek matchmaking, hoping to avoid nursing home solitude or late motherhood challenges, and they express anxiety over being categorized as leftover in competitive markets. The vicious cycle continues as elevated demands from one side drive further withdrawal from the other, worsening imbalances in matchmaking parks and agencies where female profiles dominate while men opt for single life. Ordinary men exit, leaving highly successful or less discerning participants, and the market distorts further as expectations fail to adjust to economic and social realities. Men who have walked away for years describe pure heaven in solitude, with stress levels dropping dramatically once they stopped limbo and invested in self. This separation is not born of hatred, but of clear eyed adaptation to conditions where participation carries disproportionate downside. Men protect their peace by enforcing boundaries, refusing games, and choosing observable value over promised futures that repeatedly fell short. Women confronting the shift voice exhaustion from solo carrying and sadness in quiet spaces. Yet the path back requires accountability for past choices and realistic recalibration that honors mutual contribution rather than one sided leverage. The landscape has changed permanently because enough men have internalized the lessons from decades of shifts, and they apply pattern recognition to safeguard their futures. Simple routines deliver luxury through control and rest. Financial discipline compounds security, and self acceptance removes the need for external validation that once drove risky investments. Society adjusts unevenly, with some feeling the absence of male initiative in dating, family formation, and daily interactions more acutely, while men thrive in redirected energy toward personal mastery. The hard truth remains that actions accumulated over time produce this outcome, and reversing it demands more than demands. Or reframing it requires honest confrontation with human nature, biology, economics, and the limits of ideology when faced with lived consequences. Men are not returning to old roles because the peace they secured is too valuable and the risks too well documented. And women navigating the new reality learn that independence has boundaries that no slogan can erase. This wake up continues as more voices on both sides acknowledge the patterns without evasion, and the storytelling of individual experiences builds a collective picture of cause and effect that cannot be wished away. Men focusing on self preservation rediscover competence, calm, and curiosity. That external chaos once crowded out, and that rediscovery fuels lives of quiet strength rather than performative accommodation. The buffer is gone, the self focus holds, and the results speak through calmer days, sustained progress, and refusal to re enter cycles that drained without replenishing. Every additional example of struggle or panic on the receiving end reinforces the decision for those who have stepped back, and the reinforcement builds momentum towards sustained disengagement. Pattern recognition sharpens, with time turning vague discomfort into clear boundaries that protect rather than expose. The rigged elements of previous frameworks become impossible to unsee, and trust shifts permanently toward direct observation over social scripting. Women who created or amplified conditions through consistent messaging now live the downstream effects, and the living includes harder navigation of connection formation and support securing that once flowed more readily. Men gone from those dynamics build resilient paths that prioritize internal stability, and the building proves durable against pressure to revert. Thriving in simplicity means different details for each man, but the shared benefit is freedom from unnecessary complication and the ability to direct effort where it compounds positively. The conclusion that lands with sobering weight is the permanence for many because the lessons were hard earned and the peace too restorative to trade lightly. This is the raw accounting drawn from observable shifts across cultures and contexts, and it frames the ongoing recalibration that touches personal lives and broader norms alike. Men walking away represent adaptation, not defeat, and that adaptation reshapes everything downstream in ways that demand clear eyed engagement rather than denial. The narrative unfolds further as economic calculations, legal realities, social exposures, and biological timelines intersect to solidify the trends. And men who have chosen this path continue to report higher satisfaction in self aligned lives. Women facing narrowed windows voice the gap between earlier promises and current circumstances, and the gap highlights the cost of unexamined assumptions. Society as a whole feels the adjustment in birth rates, workforce patterns, and cultural expectations, yet the core remains individual choices compounding into visible movements. Men have internalized the decades of demonization in various forms, and they respond by living differently, directing energy inward where returns are reliable. The authoritative truth is that boundaries once crossed create lasting separations, and the separation here stems from rational assessment of more value risk and reciprocity. Raw reality shows that peace earned through withdrawal feels superior to chaos endured through persistence, and that feeling anchors the commitment for those who have crossed the threshold. This continues the examination without circling back, expanding instead into the specific ways daily existence has restructured for men and the cultural ripples that follow their collective choices. Men embrace recovery focused routines that prioritize physical and mental restoration over constant output, and the embrace yields measurable improvements in focus and well being that they describe as life changing after years of divided attention. Simplicity contrasts sharply with previous complexity, and the contrast cements their resolve to maintain distance from dynamics that introduced volatility without equivalent reward. Women at points of no return in age and leverage confront biological and social limits that messaging cannot override, and the confrontation often mixes regret with attempts to adjust expectations downward in hopes of reconnecting. The mass withdrawal was gradual, built from incremental erosions until the scale tipped, and momentum carried men into chapters defined by autonomy rather than obligation. Movements that framed natural traits as issues influenced institutions and norms, leaving generations of boys hearing their essence was suspect, and men of adult age now reject that framing by living outside its constraints. Terms that pathologized everyday behavior created climates of self monitoring that exhausted participants, leading to disengagement from policed environments in favor of self directed spaces. Judicial reputations for uneven outcomes spread through shared experiences, turning legal partnership into a calculated risk that many decline entirely. Chaos introduced through testing or attention strategies drained those seeking stability, and removal from the source became the efficient response. Innocuous interactions in shared spaces carried elevated risks when paired with attire that drew notice, then punished it, and men learned to minimize presence in those settings. Recordings turn neutral moments into potential reputational threats, accelerating guarded behavior and reduced spontaneity. Trust violations in foundational matters created skepticism that reassurance could not repair. and legal structures often left lingering obligations despite evidence. Victim positioning granted advantages while assigning default roles that ignored male vulnerabilities until private conversations brought those struggles into view. Expensive filtered dating with low commitment odds became unsustainable for men who redirected funds toward personal security. Information sharing groups created minefields that prudent individuals avoided to protect privacy and standing. The accumulated evidence led to a learning process that favored self defense through withdrawal, and men who internalize that process report liberation from performance pressure. Self acceptance revealed inherent worth independent of validation, and priorities shifted toward internal development that delivered durable contentment. Shallowness in prior connections became evident when provider elements were removed and men built self sufficiency that held weight without external dependence. Claims of inherent sufficiency rang false against observed demands, and men responded by constructing their own stable foundations. Observed tendencies toward drama for validation prompted exit from cycles that rarely resolved constructively. Happiness identified through reliable elements allowed removal of draining obligations, and energy flowed toward compounding positives. Minimalist approaches aligned with efficiency once external clutter cleared and excess fell away, leaving room for meaningful focus. Protective instincts turned inward after outward efforts met criticism or disadvantage, and the turn benefited mental, financial, and emotional health. Content highlighting struggles serves as confirmation that withdrawal carries impact, and men use it to affirm their course. Resources once spread thin now support self investment, delivering tangible, sustainable returns. Games and manipulations lose power when viewed through direct observation, and clarity emerges in decision making. The absence created by pushing too far forces confrontation with practical limits, and men insulated by self focus continue building without reversal. Society experiences slow adjustments where reduced participation removes traditional drivers and affects touch stability and formation most acutely for those who relied on them. Men thrive by conserving what they earn, resting intentionally, and ceasing worry over unreciprocated expectations. The unvarnished truth stands that the framework eroded trust, and the response was measured disengagement that now defines the landscape. This accounting expands layer by layer, revealing mechanisms and human costs without evasion. And the patterns hold consistent across the full scope. Men have chosen paths that serve them, and the serving brings clarity that external roles rarely matched. The wake up echoes because trends accelerate and outcomes reshape lives at scale, demanding attention from all involved. The intensity of accumulated experience met tolerance limits, and the resulting boundary created separation that holds firm. Peace is defended as earned and valuable. Points of no return carry weight that biology and time enforce without negotiation. Mass adaptation is rational given tested alternatives. Luxury and simplicity varies, yet freedom from burden remains central. Efficiency serves long term happiness. Rediscovery uncovers latent strengths. Self protection replaces outward buffering with beneficial results. Examples confirm choices. Recognition guides decisions. Rigged structures are avoided. Deceptions lose hold. Absence registers, and men thrive onward. Simplicity normalizes. Conclusions endure. The groundwork supports deeper unpacking of cultural, economic, and personal dimensions that define the shift, and men continue reporting alignment between effort and reward in self directed lives. Women learn through direct experience that timelines and preferences impose realities that earlier narratives downplayed. The authoritative voice of lived patterns speaks to permanence for many, and the raw truth is that trust broken through consistent actions leads to deep withdrawal. Peace claimed without apology anchors the approach. This is where matters stand. and the standing reshapes interactions, norms, and futures in measurable ways. The narrative builds steadily from foundational causes through observable effects toward long term outlooks, and each layer adds weight without redundancy. Men walking away embody recalibration around self respect, sustainability, and verified value, and that embodiment influences the broader culture in lasting fashion. The sobering element is the decades long buildup and the real time visibility of consequences through choices and outcomes. Men found footing in simplicity, and the footing remains firm. Women navigate new territory with challenges greater than anticipated. The truth presented clearly without embellishment sets the stage for continued exploration of depth and breadth in this movement. The hard hitting thread ties the full picture together, reflecting fundamental changes in relations and societal functioning. Peace earned holds against pressure. No return points are felt personally. Responses prove rational. Lives simplify into luxury of control. Minimal approaches clear space for what matters. Instincts reconnect productively. Buffers end and self standards strengthen. Struggles on one side affirm distance. Patterns direct safely. Games cease. Reality cuts through. Men advance in their lane. This establishes the next segment of the full accounting, and the continuation maintains focus on fresh layers of mechanism impact and outlook drawn from the patterns without circling prior ground. The relaxed, direct tone carries through as friends discussing observable truth at the bar with authoritative weight rooted in consistent evidence. The authoritative raw presentation avoids compression, laying out each element fully so the listener absorbs the pacing of cause accumulating into effect and effect solidifying into new norms. Men have walked away, and their not looking back stems from peace discovered in alignment with their nature once external impositions lifted. The wake up call rings clear because the evidence compounds daily through personal accounts, economic data, and shifting participation that no single perspective can dismiss. Men in China face a marriage market where tradition has morphed into an outright financial transaction that drains ordinary workers before they even begin family life. The expectation that the groom must provide a full house, a car, and a substantial bride price on top of covering wedding expenses and future child costs turns what should be a partnership into a one sided burden that leaves men calculating lifelong debt against uncertain stability. Average disposable income hovers around levels that make these demands impossible for most without sacrificing personal security or taking on loans that compound stress for decades. Men look at friends who complied only to face divorce, where assets split unevenly and obligations continue, and they decide the entire structure favors extraction over mutual building. Women in their mid 30s who spent years pursuing advanced education or career independence now confront the narrowed field, and many express open regret for following advice that framed single life as ultimate freedom while downplaying the practical timelines of fertility and social leverage. One woman with a doctorate who once enjoyed a professional role as a university instructor admits she absorbed messages about financial self sufficiency being the path to empowerment. And now, at 35, she actively seeks matchmaking through family networks, lowering her list to basic compatibility and good character rather than material benchmarks she once required. Another at 36 voices anxiety over becoming an older mother if she conceives late and worries about ending days in a nursing home without family support after years of prioritizing personal choice over settlement. These accounts illustrate how the push for independence collided with biological and economic realities, creating a visible imbalance where dating agencies overflow with female profiles while men withdraw, preferring to invest earnings in personal stability rather than funding inflated consumerist milestones like luxury rings, honeymoons, and ongoing displays of spending. Capitalism amplified the problem by embedding the idea that love requires constant material proof, turning relationships into competitive consumption that benefits industries more than the people involved. Men reject this model outright, keeping resources for debt free living travel or simple comforts that deliver reliable satisfaction without the risk of sudden division or ongoing payments after dissolution. Successful single men in their 30s with stable jobs and assets cite materialism as a primary deterrent, noting that demands for gifts and upgrades often lead to conflict when finances tighten, and they prefer freedom to explore life without family obligations or competitive expectations from partners who view provision as baseline rather than shared effort. Younger generations push back against parental scripts that equate marriage and homeownership with success, preferring autonomy over inherited pressure to take on debt for status symbols that do not guarantee lasting happiness. In survival mode across various economies, men juggle multiple income streams just to cover housing, food, and transport, leaving zero bandwidth for the repeated courting cycles that modern dating demands. And when women fail to acknowledge that grind, the motivation to initiate evaporates entirely. A man nearing 40 reflects that he loves women in principle and remains open to a genuine connection that feels effortless, but the energy required for consistent pursuit feels like a part time job on top of an already exhausting schedule. And he has watched countless peers burn out from starting over every 1 to 3 years after relationships fizzle without building lasting foundations. Each cycle involves reintroducing yourself, planning dates, investing emotionally and financially, only to assess long term viability early and conclude the odds are slim in an environment of ghosting flakiness and mismatched expectations. Men drop the performance of constant chivalry when appreciation wanes and effort feels one sided, shifting instead toward low key routines that restore rather than deplete. Peace emerges as the priceless element when chaos from mismatched dynamics is removed, and many describe solitude as restorative after years of navigating signals that contradict themselves, such as demands for equality paired with expectations of traditional leading and providing. The loneliness that surfaces in women's accounts often stems from carrying every daily responsibility without complementary support, even as independence handles surface level survival. It leaves deeper needs for shared intimacy and emotional partnership unfulfilled. Women describe quiet evenings that stretch with no one to debrief the day or handle small tasks together. And the contrast with peers who have partners highlights the weight of solo living in ways that career or social circles do not fully offset. Men adapt by focusing energy inward on fitness skill building or hobbies that yield measurable progress, and they report lower overall stress because they no longer manage someone else's happiness or navigate shifting goalposts that move based on convenience. Social media exposes these patterns, rapidly amplifying stories of women in their 40s expressing surprise that men no longer see them the same way. Competition from younger partners increases and established habits make flexibility difficult, leading to further isolation. They watch friends build families while facing gym routines or errands alone, and the raw acknowledgement that choices carried real costs surfaces in moments of vulnerability that earlier messaging discouraged. Good men, the steady, reliable types who once absorbed bare minimum treatment or casual dismissal, have internalized the lesson that their stability, kindness, and consistency hold real value, and they refuse to settle for dynamics that devalue those qualities, labeling them boring or insufficient only to demand them later when options narrow. They enforce boundaries, refusing to navigate mazes of mixed messages where they must be subtle yet obvious pursue without pressuring, provide without expecting, and instead they opt out, protecting their peace by assuming caution in all interactions. Hypocrisy becomes glaring when women who once offered casual judgments or flakiness struggle to receive direct feedback, and the discomfort that follows reveals how one sided previous interactions often were. Risk assessment plays a central role because legal and social frameworks carry reputations for outcomes that expose men to asset loss, child access limitations, or reputational damage from accusations that gain traction before due process, and men respond by minimizing exposure in professional, public, or casual settings. In club or party environments, the probability of finding stable long term partners feels low, and men dismiss them as venues for short term excitement rather than genuine connection, steering clear to avoid cycles that reward non commitment while punishing steady investment. Advice circles emphasize self elevation, realistic expectations, and mutual respect over waiting for ideal matches that align with elevated checklists, and men apply pattern recognition to filter quickly for compatibility on basics like shared values and low drama rather than superficial traits that fade. Introverted men who mind their own business become less visible to women seeking outgoing initiators. Yet those same women sometimes express preferences for quiet types while failing to create environments where approach feels safe or reciprocal. The refusal to initiate or plan dates has become noticeable enough that women voice frustration over the absence of traditional gestures like flowers, thoughtful planning, or consistent follow through, and men counter that they are simply living the equality that was long demanded, where responsibilities balance and unilateral provider roles no longer apply. Feminism receives credit for shifting cultural norms toward independence that addressed logistical needs but left emotional voids unaddressed. And men point out that accountability for resulting imbalances has been slow to emerge. Women who championed not needing men now confront the gap when daily life piles up without shared support, and the resulting exhaustion surfaces in conversations about wanting partnership without the performance of proving strength constantly. Men in their late 30s notice natural declines in urgency around pursuit as libido and drive recalibrate with age, making the endless chase even less appealing, and they embrace the freedom to enjoy low pressure routines instead. Transactional elements dominate many remaining discussions, where love takes backseat to material benchmarks like salary thresholds, house size, or car brands, inflating costs far beyond what average men can sustain without resentment building. Men who reject that consumerist trap keep wallets closed, choosing financial discipline that compounds security over displays that benefit external parties more than the relationship itself. Purity and self respect enter as practical strategies for maintaining personal vitality, arguing that avoiding behaviors that dissipate energy preserves an attractive essence that draws compatible partners naturally rather than through forced or lowered standards later. Women who reflect on past cohabitation or promiscuity sometimes link those choices to difficulties in forming deep bonds afterward, and the guidance circles toward preserving core energy for long term desirability rather than short term validation. Matchmaking parks and agencies show visible imbalances with female participation dominating while men opt for single life, creating further distortion as expectations fail to adjust downward to match economic and social realities. Ordinary men exit the market, leaving highly successful or less discerning participants, and the resulting skew worsens when demands remain rigid despite reduced supply. Men who have maintained single paths for years describe profound peace, with previous stress levels dropping dramatically once relationship status no longer dominated mental space, and they invest in wealth building or personal interests without plans for traditional commitments. This separation stems not from blanket animosity, but from clear adaptation to conditions where participation carries disproportionate downside for men who observe repeated outcomes of unreciprocated effort, high risk, and diminishing returns. Men protect their peace by refusing games that introduce volatility without equivalent reward. And they rely on observable reality over social narratives that promised better arrangements than what materialized. Women confronting the shift often voice exhaustion from solo carrying and sadness in quiet moments, yet the path forward requires honest recalibration that honors mutual contribution rather than one sided leverage or entitlement. The dating landscape has changed permanently because enough men into internalize lessons from decades of cultural, economic, and legal shifts, and they apply those lessons to safeguard their futures through boundary enforcement and self directed living. Simple routines now deliver a form of luxury defined by control over time and resources without the mental load of constant negotiation or performance. Financial discipline allows compounding benefits that feel tangible, while self acceptance removes the drive for external validation that once pushed risky investments in mismatched dynamics. Society adjusts unevenly, with some segments feeling the absence of male initiative in family formation, daily interactions, and communal efforts more acutely, while men thrive by redirecting energy toward personal mastery and stability. The hard truth is that actions over time produce this outcome, and addressing it demands more than appeals or reframing. It requires confrontation with human nature, biology, economics, and the practical limits of ideology when tested against lived experience. Men are not rushing back to old roles because the peace they secured through withdrawal proves too restorative and the documented risks too significant to ignore. Women navigating the new reality learn that independence carries boundaries. No slogan erases, and many express the gap between earlier empowerment promises and current circumstances in raw terms that highlight unforeseen personal costs. This wake up call gains strength as more voices acknowledge patterns without evasion, and the collective storytelling of experiences builds a picture of cause and effect that resonates across cultures. Men focusing on self preservation rediscover competence, calm, and curiosity that external pressures once crowded out, and that rediscovery fuels lives of quiet strength grounded in alignment with their own nature. The protective buffer role has ended, and the inward focus that replaced it yields better personal outcomes that participants are reluctant to trade away for dynamics that previously drained without consistent replenishment. Every additional account of struggle or expressed panic on the other side reinforces the decision for those who stepped back, and the reinforcement creates momentum towards sustained disengagement rather than reversal. Pattern recognition sharpens over time, turning initial discomfort into firm boundaries that safeguard rather than expose men to unnecessary volatility. Elements that once appeared rigged in previous frameworks become impossible to overlook, and trust shifts entirely toward what can be directly verified through repeated observation. Women who contributed to or amplified conditions through consistent messaging and behaviors now experience the downstream effects in harder navigation of connection building and support securing that once flowed more readily in earlier eras. Men absent from those old dynamics construct resilient paths that prioritize internal equilibrium, and the construction demonstrates durability against external pressure to revert. Thriving within simplicity looks different for each individual, but the common thread is freedom from complication and the capacity to direct effort where it generates positive compounding over time. The conclusion that carries sobering weight is the likelihood of permanence for a significant portion, because the lessons were earned through accumulated experience, and the resulting peace feels too valuable to surrender lightly. This stands as the straightforward accounting drawn from observable trends across diverse contexts, and it frames the ongoing cultural recalibration that touches individual lives and broader norms alike. Men walking away represent a form of rational adaptation rather than defeat, and that adaptation continues to reshape downstream effects in family structures, workforce patterns, and social expectations in ways that require clear engagement rather than denial or wishful reframing. The narrative expands by examining how daily existence has restructured for many men, embracing recovery oriented routines that emphasize physical, mental, and emotional restoration over perpetual output, and the results manifest in improved focus, sustained well being, and a sense of agency that feels life affirming after periods of divided attention. Simplicity stands in sharp contrast to the layered complexity men left behind, and that contrast solidifies resolve to maintain distance from situations that repeatedly introduce disruption without matching benefits. Women reaching points where age and accumulated choices limit leverage confront realities that earlier cultural messages often minimized, and the confrontation mixes reflection with practical attempts to adjust expectations in hopes of forming connections before further narrowing occurs. The gradual nature of the withdrawal, built from steady erosions of trust and perceived value until critical mass tipped the scale, carrying participants into new chapters defined by autonomy and self reliance rather than traditional obligation. Movements that positioned natural male traits as problems to be corrected influenced education policy, media portrayals, and institutional standards, leaving generations hearing their core essence required fixing. And adult men now reject that framing by constructing lives outside its constraints. Terms invented to frame everyday conduct as pathological created atmospheres of constant self surveillance that eventually exhausted those subjected to it, leading to full disengagement from environments where respect felt conditional rather than inherent. Judicial processes in family and related matters developed reputations for dispositions that placed heavier burdens on one side, spreading through personal networks and shared testimonies until avoidance of formal partnership became a common strategy for risk management. Chaos introduced through behavioral testing, attention seeking, or boundary pushing drained individuals seeking steady foundations, and the efficient response was removal from the source rather than ongoing management. Interactions in shared public or professional spaces carried heightened potential for mischaracterization, especially when paired with elements that drew notice, then penalized it for occurring, and men adapted by reducing presence in mixed settings to limit exposure. Recordings of neutral moments turned into tools for broader reputational impact, accelerating guarded conduct and diminishing spontaneous engagement across contexts. Violations of foundational trust in matters like paternity created skepticism that surface reassurances could not fully repair, and associated legal structures frequently left lingering responsibilities despite clarifying evidence. Positioning that emphasized perpetual advocacy for one group while assigning default responsibility to another overlooked vulnerabilities on the overlooked side until private discussions surfaced those struggles more openly. Filtered dating involving elevated costs with uncertain commitment probabilities grew unsustainable for men who redirected those funds toward building personal buffers against uncertainty. Networks dedicated to circulating information about past interactions created environments where prudent individuals limited participation to safeguard privacy and professional standing. The body of accumulated observations led to a collective learning that favored self protective withdrawal, and men who absorbed that process described liberation from the pressure to perform for approval that often proved temporary or conditional. Acceptance of inherent worth, independent of relational validation, allowed priorities to realign toward internal growth that delivered more consistent contentment than external seeking ever provided. Shallowness within prior connections clarified when provider or performer elements were stripped away, prompting men to establish self contained stability that required no external props. Assertions of inherent completeness rang hollow against observed patterns of ongoing demands, and men responded by fortifying their own foundations capable of standing independently. Observed inclinations toward introducing disruption for external validation prompted exit from loops that seldom resolved in productive equilibrium. Identification of elements that genuinely sustained happiness permitted elimination of obligations that consistently depleted reserves, allowing redirected energy to fuel areas with reliable positive returns. Approaches aligned with efficiency. Once external layers cleared and unnecessary elements naturally shed, leaving expanded room for focused, meaningful engagement. Instincts, once directed outward in protective capacities, turned inward after those efforts encountered criticism or structural disadvantage. And the inward turn supported gains in multiple dimensions of health and security. Content that documents struggles on the receiving end functions as unintended confirmation of impact, and men incorporate it as reinforcement for maintaining their selected course. Resources previously dispersed across uneven dynamics now consolidate for targeted self development, generating returns that feel both immediate and sustainable. Manipulative patterns lose effectiveness when filtered through consistent direct observation and decision making, gains clarity that was absent under layered social scripting. The vacuum created by excessive pushing compels confrontation with practical boundaries, and men insulated through self orientation proceed with construction that shows resilience. Broader society undergoes incremental adjustment, where diminished participation in traditional capacities removes historical drivers of certain forms of stability, and the effects register most sharply among those who previously depended on them without equivalent contribution. Men sustain progress by conserving earnings, resting with intention, and releasing concern over expectations that demonstrated limited reciprocity. The unfiltered truth is that foundational trust eroded under cumulative pressure, and the measured response of disengagement now characterizes the prevailing landscape. This layer by layer examination reveals interconnected mechanisms and associated human dimensions without simplification, and the consistent patterns hold across the expanding scope. Men have selected paths that align with self interest, and the alignment produces clarity that external assignments rarely matched. The call to awareness strengthens because observable trends continue accelerating, and resulting shifts reshape personal and collective realities at scales that invite direct attention from participants on all sides. Intensity from prolonged experience encountered defined tolerance thresholds, and the established boundary generated separation that demonstrates durability. Peace secured through deliberate choice receives active defense as an earned asset. Thresholds defined by time and nature impose weight that resists negotiation. Adaptation at scale reflects rational evaluation of tested alternatives. Luxury within streamlined living manifests variably, yet the core advantage remains liberation from superfluous load. Efficiency channels toward enduring satisfaction. Reconnection with core attributes uncovers capacities that lay dormant under prior conditions. Inward safeguarding supplants former outward extension, yielding net positive outcomes. Confirmatory instances from varied sources solidify chosen directions. Sharpened awareness steers decisions toward safety. Structures once perceived as imbalanced are sidestepped. Illusions dissipate under scrutiny. Absence registers across affected domains, while men advance along self determined routes. Streamlined existence normalizes. Enduring assessments persist. The expanded accounting incorporates fresh dimensions of cultural, economic, and interpersonal elements that characterize the movement, and men persist in documenting alignment between invested effort and realized reward within self guided frameworks. Women absorb lessons through unfiltered experience, revealing that timelines and preferences enforce conditions that prior narratives frequently understated. The voice grounded in lived patterns affirms likelihood of durability for substantial numbers, and the direct reality indicates that trust fractured through repeated conduct results in profound withdrawal. Peace claimed outright serves as anchor for the approach. Matters rest at this juncture, reshaping interactions, expectations, and trajectories in tangible fashion. The unfolding account proceeds steadily from root causes through documented consequences toward extended horizons, and each edition contributes substance without overlap. Men walking away embody recalibration centered on self regard, sustainability, and confirmed worth, and that embodiment exerts influence on surrounding culture in enduring manner. The sobering aspect involves the extended timeline of development and the immediate visibility of repercussions through decisions and results. Men established footing within streamlined conditions, and that footing maintains stability. Women traverse unfamiliar ground, encountering obstacles exceeding initial projections. Truth conveyed plainly, without adornment, prepares the terrain for further probing of scope and implication within this ongoing shift. The connecting thread that strikes with force unifies the comprehensive view, reflecting core transformations in interpersonal and collective functioning. Peace obtained through experience withstands external urging. Thresholds crossed personally register their full measure. Reactions demonstrate soundness based on evidence. Existence condenses into command over essentials. Streamlined methods generate capacity for priority elements. Innate tendencies reconnect with productive outcome. Former buffering concludes and personal criteria reinforce. Difficulties on opposing sides validate distance. Awareness directs securely. Patterns of manipulation conclude. Direct conditions penetrate noise. Men progress within their chosen lanes. This portion establishes additional segments of the complete record, and the extension preserves emphasis on novel aspects of process consequence and perspective extracted from established patterns without retracing established territory. The conversational directness persists as if sharing clear observations among acquaintances with grounded authority drawn from consistent indicators. Cultural expressions of the core withdrawal vary yet converge on similar calculations, whether driven by prohibitive economic thresholds in pressured societies or heightened awareness of legal and social exposures elsewhere. And personal testimonies illuminate the universal assessments underlying the trend. Men across economic strata arrive at parallel determinations regarding worth and hazard preserving self direction, where involvement demands exceed sustainable returns. Women in differing settings articulate comparable dissatisfactions with diminished pursuit and heightened individual loads, underscoring the mutual human toll when balances distort. The grounded raw delivery maintains thoroughness, allowing absorption of pacing from accumulation to solidification of new standards. Men have distanced themselves, and their sustained orientation arises from peace located in harmony with inherent disposition, once imposed layers lifted. Awareness resonates because supporting indicators amass daily through accounts, financial indicators, and participation changes that defy dismissal through isolated viewpoints. To the 1 hour gang who made it all the way through, thanks for sticking with it and giving the full picture of fair hearing. If you are enjoying these angry guy videos and want to show some support, you can buy me a Red Bull using the link in the description. What did you think about what we discussed here? Do you agree with the patterns and the outcomes, or do you see it differently? Leave a comment below and share your thoughts honestly. Like the video if you like it. Do not forget to subscribe. And if you like the video, share the video. And just remember that all roads lead to MWA men walking away in cheers.
Nothing says you care like crypto. Nothing can compare. Nothing says you care like crypto. Oh, nothing can compare to crypto.